The flashing red and blue lights cut across the lake like a warning from fate itself, reflecting off the still water as neighbors gathered on their docks, whispering and pointing. I remember thinking, this can't be happening. Not here. Not today. My phone buzzed in my pocket at the exact moment the patrol car doors slammed shut, and that's when I realized a single angry phone call had set something irreversible in motion. She thought she was calling the cops on my son. What she didn't know was that the law was already standing right in front of her. It all started on what was supposed to be a perfect summer afternoon at our private lake. The air smelled like pine and water, the sun sat high and bright, and my son was down by the shoreline doing his routine patrol. To most people, he just looked like another local enjoying the day. No uniform. No badge on display. Just a calm presence, watching, listening, making sure everyone followed the lake regulations that kept wildlife and people safe. Then she showed up. Her voice carried across the water before I even saw her. Sharp. Accusatory. Loud enough to turn heads. She was furious about my son asking her to move her jet ski away from a protected nesting area. Rules, she insisted, didn't apply to her. This was her lake, her weekend, her freedom. My son stayed calm, explained the law, and offered alternatives. That only made her angrier. You can't tell me what to do, she snapped, pulling out her phone. I'm calling the police. The moment those words left her mouth, something inside me tightened. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to warn her. I wanted to say, you really don't know what you're doing. But I stayed silent, watching as she dialed with shaking fingers, pacing the dock like a prosecutor rehearsing a case she thought she'd already won. She told the dispatcher everything: how a man was harassing her, threatening her fun, abusing authority he didn't have. With every exaggerated word, more neighbors gathered. The tension thickened. My son stood still, hands visible, expression unreadable. He didn't stop her. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited. Because he knew something she didn't. And when the sirens finally echoed through the trees, signaling the arrival of the police, her confident smirk said it all. She believed justice was on her side. She believed she was about to win. She had no idea this was the moment everything would fall apart. The police cruiser rolled to a stop near the dock, gravel crunching beneath its tires, and the woman's posture shifted instantly. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and that smug confidence returned to her face like a mask snapping back into place. She waved eagerly at the officers as they stepped out, as if greeting old friends who had come to rescue her from some great injustice. In her mind, the story was already over and she was the hero. My son remained exactly where he was, calm and motionless, eyes focused on the lake instead of the unfolding drama. To anyone watching, it might have looked like guilt or fear. But I knew better. He wasn't nervous. He was patient. Years of experience had taught him that rushing the truth only made things messy. She's over here, the woman called out loudly, pointing at my son like a prosecutor pointing to the accused. That's him. He's been harassing me all afternoon. The officers exchanged a quick glance before approaching. One of them asked her to slow down and explain exactly what happened. She launched into a dramatic retelling how she was minding her own business, enjoying her jet ski, when a stranger started ordering her around, threatening fines, and ruining her day. She emphasized every word, glancing at my son as if daring him to interrupt. He didn't. Instead, he waited until the officer turned to him and asked, "Sir, is this true?" My son spoke calmly, choosing his words with care. He explained the protected wildlife area, the posted regulations, and the warnings he had already given. He never raised his voice. He never matched her anger. He simply stated facts. The kind of facts that don't need embellishment. The woman scoffed loudly. "See? He thinks he's some kind of authority," she said. That's exactly the problem. The officer nodded slowly, listening. Then he asked the question that made the air feel heavier. Sir, do you have any identification on you? I saw the woman's lips curl into a smile. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. In her mind, he was about to be exposed, a nobody pretending to be important. She crossed her arms and leaned back, satisfied. My son reached into his pocket, not hurried, not defensive. He handed over his credentials without a word. The officer looked down. And then everything changed. His posture shifted. His expression tightened, not with anger, but with sudden clarity. He looked up at my son again, then back at the badge in his hand. The second officer leaned in, eyes widening just a fraction. No one said anything for a moment, but silence spoke louder than words. The woman noticed it too. Her smile faltered. Just slightly. What? She asked, irritation creeping into her voice. What's the problem? The officer finally spoke, his tone measured and firm. Ma'am, he said, this man isn't harassing you. He paused. He's enforcing the law. The color drained from her face, and for the first time since this started, uncertainty replaced her confidence. For a split second, the woman just stared, as if she hadn't heard the officer correctly. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Confusion flickered across her face, quickly followed by disbelief. That's not funny, she said, forcing a laugh that no one returned. He doesn't look like law enforcement. He doesn't even have a uniform. The officer didn't smile. He handed the credentials back to my son with visible respect and turned fully toward her. Ma'am, he's the wildlife warden chief assigned to this lake and the surrounding reserve. He has full legal authority here. Those words landed hard. I watched her confidence crumble in real time. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes darted around, searching for support from the crowd that had gathered. Just minutes ago, those same neighbors had been nodding along with her outrage. Now they avoided her gaze, suddenly very interested in their phones, their boats, the water, anything but her. That can't be right, she stammered. He never said that. My son finally spoke again, his voice steady and calm. I don't need to announce it, he said. The law applies whether you recognize me or not. The officer nodded in agreement. He asked you to move because you were violating protected wildlife regulations. You were operating a jet ski in a restricted nesting zone. She shook her head frantically. I didn't see any signs. There are 3 posted signs, the officer replied, pointing toward the shoreline. And ignorance of the law doesn't exempt you from it. The realization settled in slowly, like a storm cloud rolling overhead. This wasn't going her way. This wasn't the triumphant ending she'd imagined when she made that call. She tried to regain control, switching tactics midstream. Well, he was rude, she insisted. He embarrassed me in front of everyone. My son didn't react. He'd heard it all before. The officer turned serious. Ma'am, making a false report to law enforcement is a serious issue. You claimed you were being harassed. That claim doesn't appear to be accurate. Her eyes widened in panic. I didn't mean it like that. I just wanted someone to make him stop. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. People shifted uncomfortably, the mood no longer entertaining but tense. The power dynamic had flipped completely, and everyone could feel it. The woman who had started this confrontation now looked small, cornered by her own words. The officer asked her to step aside to answer a few more questions. As she walked away, her earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by shaky steps and shallow breaths. The lake felt quieter somehow, as if even the water was holding still. She had called the cops expecting validation. Instead, she was about to face consequences. The officer guided her a few steps away from the crowd, just far enough that everyone could still see but not hear every word. That distance made it worse. Without her loud voice controlling the narrative, all eyes stayed fixed on her, waiting. The woman hugged her arms tightly around herself, no longer defiant, no longer loud. She looked exposed. "Let's go over this again," the officer said evenly. "You called 911 claiming harassment and abuse of authority. Now we've confirmed he is the lawful authority here." She nodded quickly, too quickly. "I didn't know," she repeated. "I swear, I didn't know." The officer sighed, not unkindly. Not knowing doesn't undo the call. Emergency services aren't a tool for personal disputes. That's when the weight of it finally sank in. Her gaze dropped to the ground. She kicked at a small stone near her sandal, the same woman who earlier had stood tall and loud, demanding obedience. Now she looked like someone replaying every decision that led to this exact moment. Behind them, my son spoke quietly with the second officer, explaining the situation in more detail. He pointed toward the nesting area, the marked buoys, the shallow water where wildlife depended on silence and safety. The officer listened carefully, nodding, occasionally glancing back at the woman with a look that was no longer patient. The crowd murmured again, this time with a different tone. Some neighbors shook their heads. Others whispered about fines, permits, rules they suddenly wanted to double-check themselves. The spectacle had turned into a lesson. The officer returned to the woman holding a small notepad. "Ma'am, you're being issued a citation for violating wildlife protection laws," he said. "And we're also documenting a false report." Her head snapped up. "A citation? For calling the police?" "For operating in a restricted zone," he corrected. "And for misusing emergency services." Tears welled in her eyes, not from regret, but from shock. "This is ridiculous," she whispered. "I was just trying to enjoy my day." My son finally stepped closer. "So is everyone else," he said gently. "Including the wildlife that lives here." "That did it?" Her shoulders slumped completely. The fight drained out of her, replaced by something close to humiliation. She signed the paperwork with trembling hands, every stroke of the pen another reminder that the situation was no longer under her control. When she finished, the officer handed her a copy and explained the next steps: court dates, fines, possible additional penalties. She barely listened. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper like it might disappear if she stared long enough. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined when she made that call. Not even close. When the paperwork was done, the officer stepped back and gave her a final, professional nod. "You're free to go for now," he said. "But you need to remove your jet ski from the restricted area immediately." She nodded without looking up. What followed was the quietest moment of the entire ordeal. No shouting. No arguing. No dramatic comeback. She turned and walked toward the dock, each step slower than the last. The same crowd that had gathered for entertainment now watched in silence. No one smirked. No one clapped. The energy had shifted from spectacle to discomfort. I noticed her hands shaking as she untied her jet ski. The machine that had once symbolized her freedom now looked heavy, like a burden she couldn't wait to be rid of. She struggled with the rope for a moment, frustration flashing across her face, but no one rushed to help. Not this time. My son stood a short distance away, giving her space. He wasn't watching her out of satisfaction. He was watching the water, scanning the shoreline, already back in his role. The situation with her was over in his mind. The work wasn't. As she finally pulled away from the dock, the engine humming low, she avoided eye contact with everyone. Her earlier dominance had evaporated, replaced by a fragile awareness that she had misjudged everything: this place, these people, and the man she had tried to overpower with a phone call. The police officers returned to their cruiser but didn't leave right away. One of them approached my son again. "Thanks for handling that professionally," he said. "Could have gone a lot worse." My son nodded. "It usually does when people feel entitled," he replied quietly. That word entitled hung in the air. Neighbors slowly drifted back to their routines. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Kids laughed again. The lake reclaimed its calm, as if nothing had happened. But for those of us who witnessed it, something had changed. The illusion that rules were optional here had been shattered. I walked closer to my son then, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "I just wish it didn't have to get that far." That was the part people rarely understand. Enforcement isn't about power. It's about prevention. About stopping damage before it happens. About protecting things that can't speak for themselves. In the distance, the woman's jet ski disappeared around the bend, leaving a faint wake behind. I wondered what she was thinking as she rode away. Anger? Embarrassment? Regret? Or maybe something deeper? Because for the first time that day, she had been forced to face a truth she couldn't argue with or shout down. The law doesn't bend just because you demand it to. After the patrol car finally pulled away, the lake felt different. Not quieter, just more aware. It was as if everyone who remained had suddenly remembered where they were and what this place represented. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, birds returned cautiously to the reeds, and conversations restarted, but with a new tone. Respect had replaced recklessness. My son resumed his patrol like nothing extraordinary had happened. He checked markers, scanned the shoreline, and answered a few polite questions from curious neighbors who now wanted to make sure they were doing everything right. The irony wasn't lost on me. An hour earlier, rules had been an inconvenience. Now they were sacred. One older man approached my son near the dock. "I've been coming here for 20 years, he said. "Never seen someone push things like that." My son nodded. "It only takes one person," he replied, "to cause lasting damage." That comment stuck with me. People think consequences come from big actions, huge disasters, dramatic crimes. But most of the time, it's the small choices. Ignoring a sign. Dismissing a warning. Assuming authority only matters when it looks official. As the afternoon stretched on, I noticed something else. The story was already spreading. Phones were out. Whispers turned into quiet retellings. By the time the sun dipped lower, the incident had taken on a life of its own, passed from dock to dock, each version sharper than the last. "She called the cops on a warden," someone said nearby. "Turns out he was the chief," another replied. "Right in front of everyone," a third added. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered like a lesson written into the air. Not one person challenged my son for the rest of the day. Not one jet ski crossed the boys. Not one argument broke out over personal rights. Authority hadn't been enforced with shouting or threats. It had been revealed. Later, as we sat near the shoreline watching the sky turn orange, I asked my son if moments like that ever bothered him. If being questioned, doubted, or disrespected ever wore him down. He thought for a long moment before answering. "It used to," he admitted. "But then I realized something. If people respected the law automatically, I wouldn't have a job." I smiled at that. The lake settled into evening calm, wildlife reclaiming spaces that had been threatened earlier in the day. Nature didn't hold grudges. It simply responded to protection or neglect. Somewhere out there, I imagined the woman replaying the day in her mind, realizing that power doesn't come from who you call, but from what's true. And truth has a way of surfacing no matter how loud someone tries to drown it out. By the next morning, the incident had already grown beyond the lake. What happened the day before refused to stay contained, like ripples that kept traveling long after the stone had sunk. I noticed it when my phone buzzed before breakfast, messages from neighbors, distant relatives, even an old friend asking, "Was that your son at the lake yesterday?" Someone had recorded part of it. Not the whole confrontation, but enough. The raised voice. The police arrival. The shift in tone when the truth came out. It wasn't posted with malice, just fascination, but fascination spreads fast. People love stories where arrogance meets reality. My son didn't look at the video. He never does. Nothing good comes from reliving it, he said simply, pulling on his boots and heading out for another day of work. For him, it was already yesterday's problem. For everyone else, it was a cautionary tale still unfolding. At the lake, the mood was noticeably different. People greeted him differently now, not with fear, but with recognition. They asked questions. Real ones. About wildlife zones. About permits. About why certain rules existed in the first place. The confrontation had done what dozens of signs never could. It made people pay attention. One woman approached hesitantly, lowering her voice. "I saw what happened," she said. "That could have been me. Thank you for staying calm." My son nodded. "Calm keeps situations from getting worse," he replied. "Most people don't want trouble. They just don't want to feel wrong." That insight explained everything. The woman from the day before hadn't wanted to break the law. She wanted to win. And when winning mattered more than listening, consequences followed. Later that afternoon, a ranger from another district stopped by. "You've become a bit of a legend," he joked. "Calling the cops on the law itself, that's a new one." My son smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'd rather be invisible," he said. "That means people are respecting the rules." As the sun lowered again, I sat watching the water, thinking about how quickly authority is judged by appearance. How easily people assume power only exists when it looks intimidating. The truth is quieter. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It waits, steady and patient, until it has to be seen. Somewhere out there, the woman was probably dealing with court notices and fines, replaying the moment her confidence collapsed. Not because someone humiliated her, but because reality corrected her. The lake didn't need shouting to be protected. It needed respect. A few days later, a letter arrived at our mailbox with an unfamiliar return address. I recognized it immediately, not by the handwriting, but by the weight of it. Heavy paper. Official tone. The kind of envelope people don't send unless they've thought long and hard about every word inside. It was from her. She didn't start with an apology. Not directly. Instead, she explained herself. The stress she'd been under. The bad week. The feeling of being challenged in front of strangers. As I read on, it became clear she was still trying to understand how a single moment had spiraled so far out of her control. Then the tone changed. "I truly didn't know who he was," she wrote. "But I realize now that shouldn't have mattered." That sentence lingered. She admitted she'd returned to the lake once since the incident, standing quietly at a distance, watching how things worked when rules were followed. How calm it was. How little enforcement was actually needed when people cooperated. She wrote about the signs she'd ignored, the warnings she'd dismissed, and how easily she'd assumed authority was something you could challenge until it proved itself. Near the end, she finally apologized. Not for calling the cops, but for believing the law only deserved respect when it came with force. I handed the letter to my son that evening. He read it slowly, once, then folded it neatly and set it down. "That's more than most people ever do," he said. "Does it change anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "The consequences still stand," he replied. "But maybe the understanding does." That was the difference. Enforcement could correct behavior. Understanding could prevent it. Over the next week, subtle changes continued. New signs went up, not louder or more aggressive, just clearer. The Lake Association held a meeting about wildlife protection, attendance higher than it had been in years. People asked thoughtful questions. Not because they were afraid of fines, but because they finally understood the why. The lake thrived. Birds returned to nesting areas undisturbed. The water stayed calmer. Even the noise level dropped. Respect had become contagious. As for my son, he went back to being mostly invisible again. No confrontations. No raised voices. Just quiet authority doing its job best when it barely needed to appear. The incident faded from conversation, replaced by something more lasting: a shared awareness that this place wasn't just for personal enjoyment. It was a responsibility. And somewhere in that realization, the real victory lived. Not in the citations. Not in the humiliation. But in the lesson that finally landed. Weeks passed, and summer slowly leaned toward its quieter end. The lake settled into a rhythm that felt earned, not enforced. Mornings were calm, afternoons respectful, evenings almost reverent. It amazed me how one confrontation born from arrogance and misunderstanding had reshaped an entire community without another word needing to be said. My son continued his work the same way he always had. No spotlight. No recognition. Just steady presence. Most days, people barely noticed him anymore, and that was exactly how he preferred it. When authority does its job well, it fades into the background. One evening, as we watched the sun melt into the water, he spoke without looking at me. "People think the law is about power," he said. "But it's really about balance." I nodded. Balance between freedom and responsibility. Between enjoyment and preservation. Between what we want and what must be protected. The lake reflected that balance now. Children stayed within safe zones. Jet skis kept their distance. Wildlife flourished where it once had been threatened. No sirens. No arguments. Just quiet cooperation. I thought about the woman again, not with anger, but with perspective. Her mistake wasn't calling the police. It was believing that authority only mattered when it served her. She had tried to bend reality to her will, only to discover that truth doesn't bend, it waits. And when it shows up, it doesn't need to shout. That day at the lake had taught everyone something different. Some learned to read signs. Others learned to listen. Some learned humility the hard way. But all of us learned that respect isn't demanded, it's earned through understanding. As darkness settled in and the lake lights flickered on, I realized how rare moments like that are. Moments where no one truly wins or loses, yet everyone walks away changed. Where conflict gives way to clarity. My son stood up, ready to head home. Another day done. Another place protected. As he walked away, he blended back into the evening like he always did, just a man among many, carrying the weight of responsibility without needing acknowledgement. The law didn't need to speak anymore. It had already been heard. And sometimes, that's the most powerful ending of all.